This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the next 60 minutes, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from across the continent and beyond. Let's start with a quick run through the markets here for you. Nigeria's main index was 16% in the red so far in the year, was being the key word there, at least until today. The main index was up by 1.8%, driven by quite a bit of demand for bank stocks. The banking index, the top 10 largest banks listed there, were up by over 7% today. That, in fact, is the highest gain we've seen in that index since January 2016, according to Bloomberg data. Here's what's coming up tonight. Flight cancellations galore as South African Airways staff gear up for a major strike. The Kenyan Finance Ministry has the green light to start taxing e-commerce transactions. And President Xi Jinping pledges to make more partnerships and support for global trade. Our first stop tonight, however, is in the skies, or more accurately, one of Africa's large carriers, South African Airways. It has cancelled flights scheduled for Friday and Saturday due to a looming strike by at least 60% of its employees in protest over wages and plans to cut more than 900 jobs. Unions are demanding an immediate wage hike of 8% in their wages and salaries, but the airline says it can only offer a 5.9% increase, and even then, only in April next year. The South African carrier, however, said it hopes this revised wage offer would avert the walkout at the state-run carrier. SAA has failed to deliver profit since 2011. Since then, it's relied on state bailout after state bailout to fund a growing financing gap. It's technically insolvent at this point. The airline is also without a permanent CEO, and it's actually yet to file its annual results for the two most recent financial years due to concerns in part about its viability as a going concern. All right, then, quite a bit to get through on this subject. So let's bring in Angelo Coppola, who joins us now live from Johannesburg with more. Angelo, this airline flies nearly 7 million passengers around the world. Assuming this strike happens tomorrow as planned from 4 in the morning, how will flight operations be affected?
Well, Raman, there was a press conference held by the two unions that are involved in this dispute at the moment about 2 hours ago. They confirmed that they are going ahead with their strike. It is going to be happening from 4 tomorrow morning. And unless, of course, the management get involved and call them back to the negotiating table. So for now, we do definitely have a strike, and it is definitely happening. They do say, like I said, they are open to those talks. But in the meantime, SAA cancelled all flights for 2 days. So on Friday morning, no flights, the whole of Friday and the whole of Saturday. No domestic, regional or international flights in SAA aircraft are going to be happening. And that's a complete halt, unheard of in terms of the airline. And it's unclear why SAA took this preemptive step to cancel those flights for those 2 days. They say it's to protect passengers. Nobody's quite sure what the reasoning actually was. They have said, of course, SAA, that they are going to accommodate passengers on other airlines where they can, and when they can't, they're going to reimburse those passengers. Of course, some commentators have suggested that this move could be the death knell for the airline, and that's in terms of the perceptions that are going to be created. There will be a huge loss of sales and a huge loss of trust in SAA, and it's unclear whether passengers will in fact go back to the airline and use them in future. So we might be at a bit of a tipping point right now, Raman.
Indeed. So, and I know this is a very murky number because, as you just mentioned, its results really haven't been published for the last 2 fiscal years. But do we have any idea how much money the carrier needs at the moment just to keep operations going?
Well, let's look at it as in terms of what they're going to lose for every day that the strike is underway. They're estimating, and the analysts are estimating, around $3.5 million a day is going to be lost if none of those flights take off for each of those days. You'll remember, of course, that some $250 million was given or as a sort of a, what's the word I'm thinking of, a protection against future payments. That's $250 million, and they're currently burning or spending around $35 million a month for their operations. Looking back, of course, you know that the airline's been a big black hole for government. They've spent in the region of $2 billion between 1997 and 2017. So some see that as a long-term commitment to an SOE that apparently can't dig itself out of this financial hole that it's in at the moment. So huge amounts of money have been spent, and some more is going to be spent in future, Raman.
So the unions say they want an 8% wage hike and they want it now, but the firm's offering a 5.9% hike, and only then in April if they get a bailout from the state. But at a time when the carrier is not profitable, it's also technically insolvent, how are these wage hikes even going to be funded?
Well, SAA says they want to retrench staff, those 944 people, to fund that increase that the unions are looking for. Unions have said in the latest round of talks, no thanks to that one. We also heard that the talks broke down across all the demands that have been laid by the unions, so neither party is budging right now. Unions say that management won't move at all, and they're expecting that increase to only kick in next year. And the unions have said today that they want those increases immediately, not next year, not February, not March, but right now. They want it, even if they get it by the 31st of December, they want those increases. And if that doesn't happen, they're going to carry on striking irrespective, regardless, and they're going to carry on. And in fact, they have made the point that the 2 days worth of cancelled flights that we talked about just now at around $3.5 million each could probably cover the members' 8% increased wage demand for the next 12 months. So they're making that point as the unions. SA, of course, hasn't moved. And the unions are suggesting that the biggest drain on South African Airways budget is in fact in the procurement area, where around $1.8 billion is spent annually and not on the staff costs. So we do have a strike starting at 4 tomorrow morning. It's going to be an early start for us, Raman.
Indeed. So the unions also did argue, and they've made this argument rather consistently. They say that they're being asked to pay the price for years of corruption and looting that they are not responsible for by past management and boards. But let's take the argument to its logical conclusion. Why has no one been held to account so far?
Well, the answer to that question is not a very simple one. In fact, we do know that quite recently, in fact about 2 or 3 weeks ago, OUTA, which is the organization undoing tax abuse, had taken the ex-SAA chair, Dudu Mnyeni, to court to have her declared a delinquent director in her role in the SAA failure. As you know, she famously claimed that she couldn't actually attend her trial because she couldn't afford the flight tickets up to Johannesburg from Durban, which is ironic if you think about it. She'll also, of course, appear at the Zondo Commission again at some point in the future to give additional evidence. And of course, she will be cross-examined by the Commission's legal team about some of the allegations that she's made. And she's also going to have to defend herself against those she's implicated. Meanwhile, we understand that there are about 9 forensic investigations that have been prepared and acted on over time. That's according to the unions, but none have been definitively acted on, they're claiming. The unions say that the senior management that were identified as having been negligent, corrupt, or bad managers hadn't been charged or disciplined or fired in any way. They'd been moved around. And it's the workers, they say, that are bearing the brunt of this mismanagement and the corruption that that state-owned entity is going through right now, Raman.
Right, one last question for you, Angelo. SAA as a business, it's been a problem for the better part of a decade now. So why keep the asset on the country's books? Why does it keep supporting it with taxpayer funding, which is at this point very, very scarce? Is there a legitimate need for an airline, or is this a really expensive vanity project?
I think everybody you'll speak to who's been looking at this business or the state-owned entity for some time will agree that it does appear to be a vanity project. Government doesn't actually need to have an airline. They don't actually need to own one, and they don't need to continually interfere in it. And that's one of the reasons why the airline, over time, via different messages from board members and from senior management, have said that there's been continuous political interference in the running of the operations, from route choices to route cancellations to promotions to use of procurement. And that's despite the fact that many of the boards in the last couple of years have had prominent business people sitting on those boards. And of course, you'll have a look and see how the people have moved off those boards once they realize that they can't actually make any difference to the actual running of the operations. So there's not one minister, in fact, that I can recall who's made a sound business case for always bailing out the airline at any point, and that includes Pravin Gordhan, who was then finance minister or now as public enterprises minister, responsible for that portfolio. So no one's quite sure why it's kept on the books. In fact, the current finance minister, Tito Mboweni, is the only minister thus far that has come out and said in public and been very vocal about it that he wants SAA to actually be either outsourced, privatized or closed. But every time he speaks out, he's stopped in his tracks, and every time he mentions it, it's as if he gets shot down in flames. So we'll have to see whether Pravin Gordhan prevails or Tito Mboweni prevails. Raman?
And at the same time, of course, the search for an investor really hasn't really borne fruit. Angela Kopler, they're live in Johannesburg. Thank you. Now then, a wider perspective of the continent. African countries are expected to witness a pretty big shift in consumption of digital content in the next 5 years. That at least is according to the latest Media and Entertainment Update Outlook by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Now, the study was carried out across 5 different markets. It includes South Africa, Kenya and Nigeria. Personal consumer preferences will drive demand for more internet-based services, but the transition, how we'll get to that point, will vary greatly across countries. Here's CGTN's Angela Kopler with the latest.
South Africa is the continent's biggest television market, but consumer appetite for content on demand, increased internet access and cheaper data are all driving a shift away from traditional mediums towards digital.
We're seeing improving mobile technologies, so we've seen the growth of 4G. We still have a lot of growth to go. So 4G is going to move from around 18 million 4G connections now in 2018. We forecast that's going to get to about 55 million 4G connections in 2023.
Internet connectivity is expected to jump to around 80% by 2023. The report forecasts online activity to be the biggest revenue generator in the next 5 years. It will also command the biggest share of advertising and content creation budgets.
So in entertainment and media companies, the challenge for them is how do I get that content to the users in such a way that they are easily able to pay for it, right? And it is delivered to them in a way which is cost effective from a data perspective, right? And is compelling and meets them in that particular place of personal preference.
In other parts of the continent where television remains king, the transition will be slower. 470 million people are still not online. 4G connections are sparse and data doesn't come cheap.
I think the cost relative to what they can get on a complete watch as much as you can, on the pay TV, we haven't reached that tipping point in terms of people being able to realistically make that shift and still afford being able to watch what they want to watch.
4G technology has brought higher online activity and changed the digital experience for consumers, but it's also boosted industries such as gaming, esports and virtual reality. The imminent rollout of 5G is also expected to deepen these new avenues and keep the entertainment industry on its toes. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
On to Zimbabwe now. It plans to cut value-added tax marginally in order to stimulate consumer demand in the economy. While presenting the 2020 budget statements to legislators, the country's finance minister, Professor Mthuli, proposed cutting the VAT rate to 14.5% from 15% effective from January 2020. He's also proposing lowering the corporate income tax rate by a much larger margin, however, down to 24% from 25%. That should give some relief, at least, to Zimbabweans who've seen their incomes eroded or in some cases completely annihilated by inflation. The finance minister also raised the non-taxable monthly income threshold to $130 a month. The finance minister, however, did paint a slightly rosier outlook as far as GDP growth is concerned. He's forecasting that the economy might grow by 3% next year after a projected contraction of about 7% this year. The Southern African nation is in the middle of its worst economic crisis in a decade that's marked by crippling shortages of foreign currency, fuel and even rolling power cuts that last up to 18 hours a day. Elsewhere, Sudan is seeking to develop its stock market, which has somehow avoided a crash during months of unrest. The market, however, has a long way to go to become attractive to foreign capital. CGTN's Teddy Wangari explains why.
In the small basement of a 2-story building next to Khartoum's central bus station, around 40 smartly dressed men and women gather around terminals for an hour a day to help map out the future of Sudan's financial market. The stock exchange they work at managed to avoid a crash during the unrest that convulsed the country this year, toppling longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir. And now it has ambitions to expand once the economy is stabilized and the country's isolation ends.
Now, the trade volume in the market in 2019, despite it has not ended yet, is estimated at $245 million from $9 billion last year. There are still 2 months until the end of the year. It may very much exceed that number.
Though still tiny, with a market capitalization of around $177 million at the end of 2018, the stock market's trade volumes have risen steadily in local currency terms over the years. It has also upgraded technology with Oman's help and hopes to connect all brokers online soon. Currently, only one brokerage firm can trade real-time online. Most trade is in sukuk, or Islamic bonds known as shahamas. Some foreigners, notably from the Gulf, have bought into the market, but many have struggled to repatriate their investments since the 2011 secession of South Sudan, which swept away most of Sudan's oil wealth and caused hard currency shortages. The market also needs to offer a greater range of tradable products, given many foreign investors are not interested in sukuk.
We need to have new products that support our strategy. Our stock movement compared to countries abroad, we're not on the same level. We are still in a recession when it comes to stocks. So as I told you, we need new products that support the country. We need new strategies to manage stocks. We need the current government to better support financial markets.
The civilian government appointed in April plans to set up a body to review investment regulations. This will encourage higher volumes once economic reforms are implemented and inflation is brought down. The government also hopes the United States will remove Sudan from its list of state sponsors of terrorism.
The Investment Authority will actually review all the investment regulatory systems and laws and so on, and ensure that we have a coherent and conducive system to attracting businesses and investment. And in this context, we think that once the economy starts to take off, then we can actually have the stock market. We can also we can have a meaningful stock market with heavy trading and activities and so on. But as you know, if the macroeconomy is broken, is not fixed, nothing goes.
Meanwhile, authorities expect to issue $89 million of sukuk this year. They are the main investment tool for banks and the public and offer a chunky annual profit rate of between 17 and 20%. Terry Wangari, CGTN.
All right, then a quick run through some company news. Let's start in the financial services sector. UAP Old Mutual has issued a profit warning. The company, which is listed on the Nairobi Securities Exchange, says it anticipates a 25% drop in earnings for the year ending 31st December 2019. The board attributes the expected decline to a weak property market in Kenya and the rather uncertain political environment in South Sudan. That said, the board does expect year-on-year improvements in underwriting margins and results from operations, and it says that should reflect some good progress in turning around the core insurance business. Still in Kenya, drivers from Egypt-based bus-hailing app Swivel, spelt as SWVL, have caved to pressure from the transportation regulator by halting services on most of their routes in Nairobi. The National Transport and Safety Authority asked the police to impound vehicles belonging to this app and to charge their crew and owners last month. The body had accused the firm of using a tour service license for public service operations, which requires a completely different permit, it says. Swivel will resume operations by the end of November when it complies with the country's regulations. Over in South Africa, Nedbank could pay off mortgages or fund holidays for a small number of customers who exhibit good financial behavior. That offer comes under its revamped rewards program. Its Greenbacks program was overhauled this year as the country's biggest lenders step up efforts to win and retain consumers. This comes in the wake of the launch of a number of upstart banks. The bank's reward criteria includes the use of cards rather than cash, responsible borrowing and saving. And finally, the luxury car maker Mercedes-Benz plans to cut jobs with the aim of making more than $1 billion in savings by the end of 2022. The cuts come as a car maker faces challenges from new and much tougher emissions targets. According to reports, this will lead to more than 1,000 jobs being lost across the company. The car makers, essentially across the world really, are facing the challenge of selling more low or zero emission models in order to meet European Union standards. That's a run through your company headlines. We're 20 minutes into the hour. You're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore Kenya's plans to tax e-commerce transactions when we come back. And Ghana's finance minister increases spending for next year by 21%. Where exactly will the money go? We'll explore next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra Naidu. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Let's focus on Kenya. Kenya's finance ministry now has the legal mandate to draw up regulations designed to tax e-commerce transactions. So changes to its Income Tax Act, which were approved by the president last week, are essentially behind this change. It defines the digital marketplace as a platform that enables the direct interaction between buyers and sellers of goods and services through electronic means. It's a very broad definition, and at face value, the change allows the state to now try and grab a share of any transactions persons resident in Kenya do with international firms as diverse as eBay, Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, you name it. Now, in June, the now suspended finance minister argued that this was all about what he perceived as lost revenue. The changes he proposed, he said, quote, has led to the erosion of our tax base, hence low tax revenue, since the existing system, he says, is not equipped to deal with these challenges, end of quote. Now, at this point, the precise regulations on who would be targeted, what the revenue threshold would be, how these transactions will be tracked and taxes assessed, all of those decisions are yet to be made. But as a rough point of comparison, consider the fact that there were mobile commerce transactions worth $19 billion in Kenya just in the second quarter of the year. So then, where does this leave the country's e-commerce ambitions? I explored that a little earlier with the chairman of CIO East Africa.
Actually, the policy regime is very confusing for actually the practitioners. Because yes, you're supporting the sector on one hand and killing it on the other. So it doesn't really make sense. And I think some of these policies are driven not from the industry perspective in terms of growing the industry, but mostly for revenue collection, so to speak. So KRA needs to collect X amount of money, and therefore, which other area do we need to tax so that we can shore up these numbers?
The finance minister had made his intent clear. He's now the suspended finance minister. But back in June, he made his intent pretty clear. It said, in saying that, look, as far as I'm concerned, I see digital platforms as essentially an item that erodes the Kenyan tax base. That's roughly a paraphrase of what essentially he said. Was there any lobbying done to try and get that off the proposed finance bill?
I think there's been, KEPSA has been at the forefront of this, and they've been engaging different organizations of government. But I think that to me sounds like a defeatist approach, because e-commerce has not even started in this country. Before we, e-commerce will only start happening when we have, for instance, proper addressing systems. Right now, we're really, it's band-aid e-commerce. You're using the infrastructure that is available to deliver a service, but it's very inefficient. Yeah. Now, when we get proper addressing, then you will start seeing e-commerce happening in this country. And if you look at the volume that can move with e-commerce, I don't think you will say this is eroding the tax base. You will actually, KRA will actually collect serious money out of that. But you have to let this sector grow.
But isn't this, especially the way the amendment was written into the income tax law, because of the way the digital marketplace was defined? I mean, it's such a broad statement, because it just basically says a place where buyers and sellers essentially arrive to trade goods and services online. So by definition, it also implies that if you're having to pay for your Netflix subscription because you're paying for a service, that they want a cut of that. If you're buying something from Amazon, they want a cut of that.
Not just Amazon, even Facebook. The way people, the small traders are trading on Facebook, you're buying something for 500 bob or 250 shillings, it means you are in that bracket. So even I think that's why our constitution actually clearly stated that some of these things need to be put to the stakeholders so that you can discuss these things. Because I don't think KRA have a clear view of what e-commerce can do. Because they're experts in tax collection, but they're not experts in IT. Yeah. So I think they need to come back to the sector, have a tete-a-tete with the sector, and the sector will actually help them define some of the areas where they can generate a serious revenue.
But is this, I mean, just from a pure technical perspective, because as I understand it, if you're going to try and figure out what I am spending on, right, if I'm paying for Netflix or for data subscription or storage subscription rather, for Google and so on and so forth, my ISP might know where my traffic is going.
That's true.
But KRA does not have a legal right to have access to that information. So isn't this, from a technical perspective, dead on arrival?
You see, it could be. It could be dead on arrival, but it could also be forced. Because you see some of these things, when you're talking about revenue collection by government, then there's some clauses which, can compel whatever ISP or whatever service provider to actually provide that number or provide that information. So it could be forced.
But, I mean, we'd still come back to what happened in Uganda last year when they introduced a social media tax, right? People just went back to using VPNs. We'd trade slower traffic for not paying the tax, which is likely to happen in this case.
There's a lot of ways in which people can evade it. There are many. But, do you want to go that direction? As opposed to actually creating an environment where people feel safe, where people feel happy to actually pay taxes.
But still in the East African economy, the tech city, the technopolis, some might call it, of Konza has been in the pipeline for years now. It's gone on a bit of a boost after a groundbreaking ceremony for a new substation and transmission line that will essentially jack it into the national grid. Kenya Electricity Transmission Company, better known as KETRACO, has awarded the construction contract to the China Aerospace Construction Group. It will be funded jointly by both countries at a cost of about $100 million. STGTN's Robert Nagila with the details.
The groundbreaking ceremony of the 400 kilovolt substation at the site of the Konza Technopolis city, Kenya's answer to Silicon Valley. The contractor, China Aerospace Construction Group, says once complete, the substation and transmission line will power the tech city and neighboring counties.
The tailor-made solution for Konza substation and the Konza Isinya line, upon its completion, will have enough and reliable power supply to the Technopolis and its environs.
The transmission line and substation, part of a network upgrade, is in line with the government's plans to increase access to electricity in rural areas from 4% to 40% by 2020. The project is financed by the Exim Bank of China and the Kenyan government at a cost of $100 million. The government says the project will attract investors to the city.
The investors who will be coming here, the first priority they will be looking for is, do we have power? And then, do we have reliable power? Therefore, I want to say I am happy that today we are commencing the work of the substation, and we have been told it's one of the best substations ever.
The Chinese government is committed, as usual, to supporting Kenya in developing technology and realizing industrialization, and will make continued efforts to contribute Chinese wisdom and strength for the development to Kenya.
The project by the Kenya Electricity Transmission Company aims to improve the quality and reliability of power supply and protect consumers against high cost of power. It is expected to be completed in 2021. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Konza, Kenya.
From East Africa to West Africa, where Ghana's government is going on quite the spending spree ahead of next year's general elections. In his 2020 budget statement, the country's finance minister proposed raising spending by 21% compared to 2019, but he still asserted that fiscal discipline will remain and overspending will be avoided. Some economists, however, are not convinced. PSUGTN's Nabil Ahmed Rufai explaining why.
Domestic revenue is estimated at 65.8 billion.
This was the last budget delivered in Parliament ahead of Ghana's general elections next year.
To raise up to $3 billion US.
In it, the government called for spending to be ramped by a fifth next year to $15.5 billion US. It's a sizable increase, but the finance minister insisted the government would adhere to the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which puts limits on excessive government spending.
We will do so not because we are complacent of our chances. No, we will do so because the nation needs it, and we are not prepared to throw away all the sacrifices and gains the people and their government have made in the last 3 years.
He was referencing the sacrifices made during the country's latest bailout, its 16th with the International Monetary Fund. Ghana exited the program in April of this year, and since then has enjoyed economic stability helped by oil, gold and cocoa exports. The IMF is expecting 7% growth this year. However, the lender cautioned against budget overspending, saying it could destabilize the country's economy.
For the last election year in 2016, the government targeted a budget deficit of 5.3% of GDP, but it could not achieve that and recorded a deficit of 7.8%.
The finance minister said the 2020 budget proposal would increase the budget deficit to 4.7%, which is below the legalized ceiling of 5% of GDP. But not everyone is convinced. The Economic Intelligence Unit projects a 5.5% budget deficit next year. Meanwhile, some opposition politicians want the government to put more focus on improving the country's economy.
You need to be able to meet the developmental needs of the people, even while trying to keep your discipline. So if you continue in 4 years to continue to spend virtually all your money in consumption, as opposed to the real developmental needs of the people, you have totally repudiated your claim to leadership.
To shore up the balance sheet, the government said it will strengthen domestic revenue generation next year and raise funds from international investors. Nabil Ahmed Rufai, CGTN, Accra, Ghana.
The Africa SME Champions Forum says it will embark on an Africa Semi-Growth Initiative to support at least 100,000 SMEs. The Champions Forum's 6th edition was hosted on the sidelines of the 2019 Africa Investment Forum in South Africa. CGTN's Ulysses Jamela was there. She filed this report.
The African Small and Medium Enterprise Champions Forum kicked off on Tuesday. Its aim is to help realize and emphasize the potential of SMEs in the economy. It's also focused at building the capacity of SMEs by preparing them for financing and exposing them to key financial institutions and funding partners. Sector representatives attended the forum. The two-day gathering has about 400 of Africa's best high-growth SMEs. Large corporations and key financial institutions, experts in business development for SMEs, policymakers, and potential investors were also in attendance, and they imparted valuable information to the entrepreneurs.
As an investor and as a donor investor trying to facilitate access to U.S. markets or to regional markets, and first and foremost, primarily if you're going to the U.S. market, are you competitive regionally? Are you already selling within your home area? Are you already branching out to within your markets? Do you have a proven concept that we can put good finance behind?
It's very important to stick to the market, to anticipate on the market evolution, and to be innovative, because scaling up needs to move to new products, to new markets, introduction of digital. So innovation is also key in the development and in the growth of the SMEs if you want really to scale up.
Some entrepreneurs are busy looking for capital, and yet all they need to do is build a strong relationship with their suppliers, in which sense they can extend credit and extend very good, allow you to be able to trade with very good terms rather than borrowing at 18% or so. So relationship management is very key.
The young startups were encouraged to dream big.
What makes the next Bill Gates? What makes the next Howard Schultz from Starbucks? What makes the next Jeff Bezos of the world? If you were to study all the Jack Ma's of the world, the Teslas of the world, and pull out their attributes, what do you see?
Some of the objectives of this forum include connecting African SMEs to large infrastructure projects, increase employment and wealth by local firms, and improve African SME access to finance.
SMEs contribute over 45% of employment in Africa and account for at least 33% of the continent's GDP.
Yolisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Time for a short break. You're watching Global Business. Here's what's coming up next. We'll have the latest for you from the BRICS summit taking place in Brazil. And global demand for toys projected to expand by over 11% next year. We'll explore why when we come back. Data out of the country. The countries have foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Perina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
I'm Ucheo reporting from Nairobi City Center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Quick run through some stories making your headlines now, starting with Kenya and Somalia. The two have agreed to normalize bilateral ties. Both countries will start with the restoration of the issuance of travel visas on arrival for their citizens. Now, the restoration of this arrangement is aimed at enhancing free movement of people and trade between the two neighbors. The agreement was announced today during a meeting between President Uhuru Kenyatta and Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed of the Federal Republic of Somalia on the sidelines of the just concluded ICPD 25 summit. And speaking of that, the International Conference on Population and Development has wrapped up today in the Kenyan capital. There are quite a few commitments aimed at ending maternal deaths, meeting family planning needs and ending harmful practices against women and girls by 2030. But global leaders were split on matters like abortion and same-sex relationships. A section of countries, in fact, failed to endorse the new non-binding Nairobi statement designed to accelerate efforts at implementing the goals of the ICPD. And finally, authorities in the Democratic Republic of Congo have introduced a second Ebola vaccine in the eastern city of Goma to deal with the deadly hemorrhagic fever. The vaccine is manufactured by the US pharmaceutical firm Johnson & Johnson. It's being used in areas where there's no active transmission of Ebola to protect people from being infected. That's a run through your headlines. China's head of state has again voiced support for trade, saying China will explore building more partnerships with countries. He spoke at the ongoing BRICS summit in Brazil.
In less than a month, Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with his Brazilian counterpart Jair Bolsonaro for the second time. Bolsonaro welcomed Xi at the Foreign Relations Ministry in capital Brasilia, following his October trip to China. President Xi said the two countries share wide-ranging common interests, and he's urging both sides to further open up their markets to each other. He also spoke about developing cooperation in Latin America.
We want to promote and build fair relations of mutual benefit, innovation, and openness for the good of the people in Latin America in this era. Based on the respect and the will of the regional countries, China will explore trilateral and multilateral partnerships to make the pie bigger and produce more mutual benefits.
China is Brazil's biggest trading partner. Its investments in Brazil between 2007 and 2018 totaled almost $60 billion. As President Xi Jinping eyes cooperation in agricultural goods, iron ore, and crude oil, Bolsonaro says his government wants to both expand and diversify trade with China. The two leaders witnessed the signing of several deals.
The agreement signed, as well as the protocols of intent, will be further developed by us in the interests of our peoples. China is becoming more and more part of Brazil's future.
Their meeting was one of many that have been held on the sidelines of the annual BRICS gathering. President Xi also met Russian President Vladimir Putin. He said China and Russia should promote bilateral ties, build a fair international environment, and oppose unilateralism and bullying. When meeting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, President Xi called for close communication in order to improve relations, as well as expanding the scale of trade and investment. Besides bilateral meetings, Xi also addressed the BRICS Business Forum. The Chinese president urged his counterparts to eradicate trade barriers and increase connectivity. He also called on the business sector to promote economic cooperation and create more jobs. Zhang Dan, CGTN.
Over the last decade, members of this bloc have worked towards finding common areas of interest. That covers everything from trade to technology. BRICS leaders have hailed it as a golden decade, in their view, and they say they're ready to start a new era of cooperation. CGTN's Gerald Tanhiver taking you back to when this alliance was formed.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Together, they form what's known as the BRICS nations. The acronym was originally coined at the start of the new millennium. It referenced the 4 emerging markets demonstrating rapid growth and vast economic potential. When South Africa joined in 2010, the S was added to the grouping. And today, the alliance is proving more resilient than ever. The 5 BRICS countries cover more than 42% of the global population, spread out over a large geographic area. And you can see the breakdown here. China and India, the world's most populous nations, have more than 1.3 billion people each. And these are some of the strongest drivers, accounting for nearly a quarter of the global economy. World Bank figures shows China eclipses the others with a gross domestic product topping $13 trillion. India's GDP is more than $2.7 trillion, while Brazil and Russia are both reaching $2 trillion apiece. This year marks 10 years of BRICS cooperation. Although there is no common political or security charter or funds to finance its activities, the countries are making more concerted efforts to enhance partnerships in a variety of areas, from global governance to trade. Gerald Tan, CGTN, Washington.
Now, the BRICS summit is underway, as you just mentioned, in Brasilia, with the leaders from all of the bloc's members over there. But there is one country that some argue could have been a member. Here's Yasser Kim with that explanation.
Egypt nearly became a BRICS member in 2010. But the political uprising in 2011 suspended plans indefinitely. There was another opportunity in what would have been known as BRICS Plus.
The idea of BRICS Plus came to existence after the success of several emerging economies. It's about adding new members from Africa and Asia to the original BRICS on condition that they have high economic growth with a strong political presence. The current BRICS forms 25% of the total GDP of the world. For Egypt to join it, it has to have similar GDP numbers and economic strength.
Egypt has been recovering from a few years of political turmoil since 2011. Growth rates are one of the highest in the continent, with 5.8%. Cairo feels a membership in this elite group can add impetus to its economic development.
It will be of great benefit to have strategic partnership within BRICS, who have $44 trillion in GDP. The G7 achieved $40 trillion of GDP, which shows the strength of BRICS. A membership would give huge trade opportunities and incentives for producers in these countries, as well as access to large investments as exclusive member states.
At the time being, however, Egypt's membership at the BRICS organization is not on the cards. Egyptian officials say Cairo will be economically ready to join the BRICS by 2025. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
On to the business of trade now. The latest in the China-US trade dispute. China has lifted restrictions on poultry imports from the US. That's according to a joint statement released by both countries. It comes after Beijing said it's willing to work together with the US to create conditions for the first phase of the agreement. A Commerce Ministry spokesperson confirmed that Beijing and Washington will discuss in depth the extent of the tariff cancellations, assuming the first phase is indeed completed.
The trade war started with rounds of tariffs and should end by phasing out tariffs. This is an important condition for China and the US to reach an agreement. Taking out the tariffs is in the interest of both countries as well as the rest of the world. For the Phase 1 agreement to come out, the scale of the tariffs taken out should reflect its importance.
On to a market of a different kind, the global market for educational toys is expected to grow at an annual rate of over 11% all the way through to 2022. That's according to fresh data from the US-based market research company Technavio. Now, the toy industry over the years has adopted technological advances, and that is said to be one of the key drivers for these increased sales volumes going forward. Technavio's latest report shows that the popularity of educational products and smart toys, from AI-based products to digital toys, is growing. The data also indicates that educators and parents are opting for eco-friendly materials, with the so-called green toys set to contribute to the industry's overall market growth. So then, what exactly are some of the best-selling toys so far this year in the UK? Yes, our coverage goes beyond just the business of Brexit. Here's our correspondent Juliet Mann with this report.
Dollies with a difference, bears that need nurturing. The UK toy industry says this year's bestsellers will be interactive and on trend.
You know, the toy industry is a very fashion-driven market and very fast-moving, and that's what we're beginning to do. We're beginning to pick up our pace, look at trends, making sure we're ahead of the game rather than behind the game.
Christmas toy spending in Britain is worth $1.3 billion.
This is the largest market in Europe, with about $3.4 billion every year. So that's a spend of around $100 per child overall. And that's much more than what we see in Germany and in France, which are the second and the third largest market.
1 in 10 toys sold around the world are linked to the movies or blockbuster brands like Harry Potter. But that doesn't mean the old favourites will disappear.
The classics are making a comeback with a twist. Barbie's looking good for 60 with a refreshed, more diverse range. And some traditional board games have gone high-tech.
You know, everything is about voice technology, and we've brought that to Monopoly, and the kids just think that's amazing, that, you know, they use Alexa like it's, you know, just normal, and so it's absolutely normal for them to have that in a board game as well.
If you're thinking, gosh, that's a lot of plastic and packaging, The toy industry is on it.
People thinking about recycling, it's a really big issue and they're totally on board with that. So we have already some initiatives from companies such as Hasbro or MGA, for example, to recycle all the packaging and even their old toys, the unwanted toys. Lego is working on a new material, so I think in a few years the plastic you see from Lego, which is durable by the way, you know that 70% of all toys being sold are passed on to another generation.
But before they're passed on to another generation, reinvented classics could make a child's Christmas this year. Juliet Mann, CGTN, London.
On to Switzerland now. There's some gemstones that are up for grabs at eye-watering prices at Christie's and Sotheby's two-day binge of jewellery auctions in Geneva. Going under the hammer are a 7-carat rectangular cut blue diamond and an emerald-dyed necklace that once upon a time was owned by Princess Salima Aga Khan. CGTN's Daniel Arap-Moy has this report.
The Art Deco era of the 1920s and 1930s on display. From a Burmese sapphire bracelet to a necklace with Colombian emeralds, these jewels embody a variety of colored gemstones. This 47-carat Burmese sapphire is the centerpiece of a collection of jewels.
It's a 47-carat from Burma that hasn't been heat-treated and has been also given an appendix letter by the Gubelin laboratory stating that it is of royal blue color, so the best you can really expect within Burmese stones. And it is flanked by two 8 and 9 carat diamond of D color. So Cartier has not spared any effort in creating this fantastic jewel at the time. This dates to 1927, and we have in the sale another splendid jewel by Cartier, created exactly at the same time, 1927. And it couldn't be different in style and design, more than style in design. But it is in a funny way what Art Deco was, extremely diverse, extremely eclectic.
Another star in the Sotheby's auction is this emerald and diamond necklace by Cartier. Once owned by Princess Salima Aga Khan, its estimate is at about $3.5 to $4.5 million. The necklace features 7 Colombian emeralds from the Muzo mines.
The finest emeralds in the world come from Colombia, and particularly from the area associated with the Muzo mine. And all these emeralds are typical of that area of production. This rich green colour, these are particularly clean, particularly absent of flaws. And to put together a group of emeralds like this is really very difficult indeed.
Fancy coloured diamonds have over the years had great deals at auction houses such as this one. However, for the global diamond market, the reality is different. Challenges continue to haunt the $17 billion industry as oversupply of rough stones and increasingly strained finances. Daniel Arap-Moy, CGTN.
All right, then a quick run through commodity prices for you. So platinum prices will be essentially the focus point, the anchor point, if you will, for this particular segment. Tax cuts being proposed by the Finance Minister. A 50 basis point cut in value-added tax and a 100 basis point cut in the corporate income tax rate to about 24%. But the question, of course, will be, if you're an economy that's contracting by 7% this year, is this by itself enough to lure you in to invest in the country's mineral sector? We'll find out. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore how groundnut sales are transforming the lives of women in Nigeria. Welcome back. Now, Nigeria is many things. It's home to the biggest population in Africa. It's also the continent's largest producer of crude oil, but it's also the largest producer of groundnuts on the continent. Over 85% of the produce comes from the country's north. Women in Dengi, the North Central Plateau state, make a livelihood from processing groundnuts in their factories. And that covers everything from extracting cooking oil to making local snacks. These women are raking in some decent cash from their produce. Here's more on that report from CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam.
This is a mini factory where byproducts of groundnuts like cake and oil are produced. Groundnut thrives well on the arid regions like Dengi community, so locals here like Salamatu Musa expect a bountiful harvest every season. She owns this mini factory, and there are many more like this one scattered around the community, and it's an opportunity for women here to earn big.
I use between 30 to 60 bags of groundnut weekly for the production of oil and groundnut cake. I do not buy from outside, as the nuts are produced here in our farm. I have about 25 people working as my employees, and we all make ends meet from this business.
The process of drying, frying, grinding and extraction all culminate into a massive trade for these group of women. For example, pure groundnut oil is in high demand because of its high proteins, vitamins and dietary fiber. It sells for an average $3 per liter. The groundnut cake is a local healthy snack popular across the country, and all of these are for the women here a source of livelihood.
This job helps me pay my children's school fees and also feed my household. I'm 8 years old in this business, and usually we save enough money to assist one another. Even for my children in tertiary institutions, I pay their fees from this job.
These women are predominantly housewives who have found fulfillment in their work, which earns them an average $500 monthly. But faulty and worn-out machines slow down their productivity. They see more earning prospects in the trade and hope to expand in the near future. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Plateau, Nigeria.
All right, then a quick run through some currencies as we wrap up the program. Egypt has had a very interesting time tapping into foreign capital markets. It came into the market, in fact, this week with some very interesting notes. There's a $500 million 40-year dollar-denominated Eurobond. I believe that's the longest dated one on record so far. Bloomberg reported the yield guidance, and that was just over 8.5%. There's also another $500 million 4-year note and a $1 billion 12-year note on offer. Collectively, that's $2 billion that the Egyptians were looking to borrow. The market came back and said, we're willing to lend you $14.5 billion, at least according to the Finance Ministry. Quite a bit of oversubscription over there. In total this year, Egypt has issued Eurobonds worth over $6 billion. That's both in the US dollar and the euro. That's it for tonight's edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program. There's several ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on our screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The world today is up next from Washington, D.C.